CSIS Center. I'm the director for the project on history and strategy here at CSIS. We have a novel and extremely naive proposition that people might care about history in think tanks in Washington. And so John is one of our experimental test cases here. He wrote a wonderful history of the NSC. Delighted to have him here. The book is really terrific. It demystifies, in really terrific ways, the black box that is the NSC staff. We're conditioned to think about presidents, national security advisors. We know very little about the people shoveling coal in the engine room below them. And I think one of John's central themes is that the people shoveling coal in the engine room sometimes are shoveling a little too enthusiastically and aggressively. And sometimes they even get control of the rudder. And they do so, and I think this is really an important point in John's book, in ways that are not necessarily accountable through any sort of legal regulatory infrastructure. And so he brings up a really profound point in writing this book about the nature of transparency and accountability in statecraft. And so we're delighted to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Take 10, 15 minutes, then we'll have a conversation, and then we'll take questions from the audience.
That sounds good. Well, thanks for having me, and thanks to Seth.
Oh, let's hold up your book too, so that we can see it. This is it's June, and so this is beach reading. That's really what this is. This is prime beach reading.
I think it is. You know, it's short. So my goal was Seth asked me because I'll tell a little bit of where this all came about. Was I was a new PhD student right across the street at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies at CSIS. And I was heading, while I was doing that, like every other PhD student in DC, I was working at a think tank. I was working at National Defense University, doing a little research to pay the bills. And I got to go to a meeting at the National Security Council to sit with the senior director. And this was right at the beginning of the Obama administration, so it was 2010. And we went in, and I didn't know who we were going to see. I was just traveling with the professor. He asked for my name and my social security number, and we showed up the old executive office building. And we walked in the room, and it happened to be a gentleman who had been sort of rude to me during my internship when I was in college. And I was like, what is that? How is he sitting here in this palatial office here in the old executive office building, acting like the president might be calling him at any minute? And we had a good meeting, and everything went fine. And he was about as dismissive in the meeting as he had been when we were interns. And I happened to be done with the meeting, and I said, I'm going to walk up and see Elliot Cohen. And I walked up to him, and I said, what does the NSC do? What is this guy going to do on the NSC? And he said, well, that's an interesting dissertation topic. That could be a perfect dissertation topic. He goes, but a lot's been written on the staff. He said, so go read it and see what you think, and come back in a couple months, and then we'll talk about it. So I came back in a couple months, and I told him, I was like, actually, not that much has been written on the staff. A lot's been written on presidents, obviously. A lot has more, especially in the Iraq War, the sort of George W. Bush years, had been written about national security advisors, but little had been done to dig out the staff, especially the staff post Iran-Contra, which is an essential point in it. And so I went about trying to learn about the staff and spent a lot of time in archives trying to understand the history, because to get to know the staff, you have to dig very deep. I went and did 9 archives, looked at about 10,000 documents, and spoke to almost 100 or so people, from everybody from Dick Cheney to unknown staffers, 12 national security advisors, to sort of write this book. And so I want to start with just a little story about one of these staffers, and then sort of get to some of the conclusions, and then happy to talk questions and get accused of breaking government by suggesting that the American people understand what government does. But so this is in July 1995, about 24 years ago, Bill Clinton was furious, right? The war in Bosnia, which by then had killed hundreds of thousands of people and created over 1 million refugees, had led to criticism of the president by the public, by his counterparts abroad, by Congress, by parts of his own government, and even by himself. And aggravated, Clinton used to scream at his aides, and he would beg anybody he met for ideas. And one day he turned to a young sailor on the staff who was there to set up a phone line for a call with a foreign leader, and said, what do you think we should do on Bosnia? And this young kid just looked at him and said, I have no idea, Mr. President. Now, at that moment in Washington in summer of 1995, very few people, for those of you who recall, had any ideas on what could actually stop the violence in the Balkans and solve the long-term ethnic and national tensions that had been prodded by Slobodan Milosevic and others, right? But one person did. And working with a few other colleagues, he sort of went and pursued those ideas together. Now, that's not an easy story to tell because this individual whose name was Nelson Drew was a 47-year-old colonel at the time in the Air Force. And most people don't know who he is. I would bet that few of you do. A few maybe worked at the staff have heard the name, but it's not a name that's known to most people. And because it's a pretty plain name, Nelson Drew, he's a pretty hard man to Google, right? Nelson Drew doesn't really dig much, and you really have to narrow your search down to get there. And even when you do find the right page, much of the history he made is still under wraps, hidden in archives and footnotes in longer books about bigger names in national security. So I want to tell you a little bit about him and some of the other White House warriors who served on the powerful, elusive National Security Council staff. Now, Nelson Drew is one of staffer of thousands who have served since Congress created the staff in one line of law in 1947. But together and alone, they have shaped the world you live in today, and they continue to serve right now at a moment of change in Washington and the world. Nelson Drew was born at another such moment. He was born to an Army officer in Würzburg, Germany in February 1948, 3 years after World War II ended and a few years before Germany itself was divided. Nelson grew up in Virginia and went to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where he met his wife, Sandy. He joined the Air Force ROTC, in part because Vietnam was going on, and that was one way to sort of continue your studies and still do your duty. But because his eyesight was so terrible, when he graduated, he was not able to become a pilot. So he became an intelligence officer. And that is just one of the first twists of fate that sort of landed Nelson Drew into the history books, right? Or at least into their footnotes. Another twist of fate was that he landed at Ramstein Air Force Base in Germany during the Iranian Revolution. And for those of you familiar with EUCOM, EUCOM used to own the area of responsibility was the Middle East, right? And so the intelligence officers in Germany were studying the Iranian Revolution. But Drew didn't know Farsi and didn't know the region. And so he was sort of sitting there with nothing to do. And so one of his intelligence supervisors kind of gave him some busy work and said, go look at Yugoslavia. Go figure out what's going to happen in Yugoslavia when Tito dies. But Drew, as was his sort of style, just kind of ran with the challenge. And in a very short amount of time, he became, as one of his fit reps said, the recognized theater expert on Yugoslavia. And after he left Germany, he continued to study and write about Yugoslavia as the Air Force took him around the United States for a doctorate at the University of Virginia, for a professorship at the Air Force Academy, and then on to other Air Force assignments. Each step along the way, though it was not a hot-button issue or a high-profile subject for those with high ambitions, Drew kept studying Yugoslavia, its history, and the delicate, dangerous balance between the ethnic groups that he had become impassioned by in 1979. That work paid off when he was sent back to Europe just as the Cold War was ending. He was put in charge of plans operations at a small Defense Department office at NATO headquarters. It was a time in the hallways of NATO and elsewhere of much hope, but also a lot of questions, as many of you know. Drew later wrote that some of his colleagues used to recite a poem, or at least quote it, by the Greek poet Constantine Cavafy. And he asked, why this sudden bewilderment? Because night has fallen and the barbarians have not come. What's going to happen to us without the barbarians? And without the threat of the Cold War, without the Soviet Union's imposing presence, many wondered what the future would hold for NATO, whether the Cold War would be replaced by a prolonged peace, and how long the United States would stay engaged in Europe to find out. While the barbarians of the past were gone, the former Cold Warrior Nelson Drew and others at NATO headquarters didn't have to look far for brutality. Though the long struggle with the Soviet Union was over, and it had ended far more quietly than many had predicted, that was not true in the Balkans, where the collection of 6 nations that really was Yugoslavia began to break apart violently and among reports of atrocities and violence. The war in Bosnia quickly became, as Drew later wrote, a test case from hell. It was a test for the ambitions of young policymakers, especially those like Drew who dedicated themselves to understanding the Balkans. It was a test of post-Cold War Europe and NATO's leaders, thinking about how to preserve unity and security on a continent still haunted by memories of past wars. A test of the United States as a superpower without peer, a test for humanity 50 years after the Holocaust, and a test for the relatively new president, Bill Clinton. And by 1995, it was a test everyone was failing. Nelson Drew, shortly thereafter, was sent to Washington, D.C. to teach at National Defense University, where I was working when I started this project. He was put on as a professor at the War College. But immediately upon arriving in Washington, it became clear that he had Balkan knowledge and the Joint Staff was desperately in need of. And he was assigned, they canceled his appointment to the War College and sent him to the Pentagon. Another twist of fate in a career that was shaped by them. He ended up in a meeting a few days later after reporting for duty at the Pentagon at an interagency policy meeting, right? Where most of you know what an interagency policy meeting is. It's where representatives of State, Defense Department, the intelligence community, White House come together to talk about whatever issue it is. And the Bosnia Interagency Policy Committee was not a fun one to be a part of. Because for 2 years, especially after the Clinton administration took on, it had been a source of deep frustration as those lower in government had struggled to get a change of policy up top. But nothing was done because President Clinton couldn't quite get his own National Security Council, whether it was the State Department, the Defense Department, or the Joint Chiefs, on board with a policy to intervene. But another NSC staffer who had joined the NSC the year before, a gentleman named Sandy Vershbow, had known Nelson Drew in Brussels when they had worked together for a brief time. And he took a little coaster, a little coaster from his water glass, and he wrote on it and passed it to Nelson. I've given your name as someone I'd like to consider to bring onto the NSC from the Pentagon. Vershbow saw in Drew someone who knew the Balkans, knew NATO, and knew the military. And if there was any chance of changing policy in the U.S. policy, they would need somebody that knew all three. On receiving the note, Drew was in seventh heaven, as his wife told me. He was a student of government, and he knew what time in the NSC could mean for his career. He was also somebody who thought that they could solve the problem in the Balkans with the right ideas and the right presidential leadership. Together, Nelson Drew and Sandy Vershbow and others at the White House came up with a proposal shortly after Nelson Drew arrived that later became known as the Endgame Plan. It combined shuttle diplomacy with a series of airstrikes and urged an all-out effort in August 1995. Eventually, Clinton basically decided that he couldn't afford not to try it, and he said he would roll every die and try the plan. The diplomatic mission, which was the central part of it, was given to Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, who's back in the news today thanks in part to a new biography that is excellent if you have a chance to read it. Second best book that's been published on foreign policy this summer. But back then, Holbrooke, who was an assistant secretary of state, was making news of another kind. He had basically given up, though he was passionate about the Balkans and deeply upset by the humanitarian catastrophe playing out there. He'd basically given up on finding a solution, right? Gone on his honeymoon in summer 1995 and told the New York Times that Clinton's policy process was a gigantic stalemate machine, which the New York Times helpfully decided to run on the front page of the newspaper, just as he was getting considered to be given the diplomatic assignment that would make his career. For that reason and more, though most agreed the forceful Holbrooke was the right diplomat for the job, the White House wanted one of its own people on his plane to keep an eye on him. So Drew got the assignment and set off thinking that his chance to make history had finally arrived. But before he ever really got started, tragedy struck. On August 1995, Drew and two other American officials were traveling from a meeting when their armored personnel carrier skidded off Mount Ignem near Sarajevo. The three died on the side of the mountain. Holbrooke, who was one vehicle ahead, survived and went on to push the parties to accept a ceasefire and begin talks at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, which would, of course, lead to the imperfect but still substantial peace in the Dayton Accords of 1995. Drew never made it to Dayton, of course. He did not live to enjoy the end of the conflict he had foreseen as an intelligence officer in the late 1970s. Instead, he was buried in Section 6 of Arlington National Cemetery, his grave one of the few related to the wars in the Balkans. And he is the only NSC staffer to ever die in the line of duty. But like those serving before and after, and those serving today, when given the chance, Nelson Drew chose to say his piece and try to make history. Drew did and paid the ultimate price for ending a humanitarian tragedy. Now, there's a lot of ways to sort of read the story of Nelson Drew, and this is one of the dozens of staffers I sort of profile in the book, right? You can see in them sort of heroic work, you know, lone voices in a complicated, broken town. You can see in them just good staffers who were sort of following the president's lead and doing what they could to try and give him the idea he had been begging everybody for. You could see in them micromanagers, you know, people who drive their colleagues at the Defense Department and elsewhere crazy. And you can see in them the whispers of like a deep state, of a conspiracy of unelected officials to try and drive policy away from where American voters were, especially in public opinion polls at the time. It's a complicated story, right? By simply speaking up, NSC staffers have changed the course of their own lives, like Nelson Drew, and history. Just as they've also transformed how America fights its wars, especially in the years after Vietnam, as Nelson Drew did it with Bosnia. Change how Washington works, right? And that was what was frustrating Richard Holbrooke at the time. And in some ways, they've changed how America's representative democracy is expected to function, and led to some distrust about how Washington works, right? Now, in return for their fights, most staffers like Nelson Drew with the endgame received the thanks of a grateful president. Clinton, who had looked so hard for ideas, said at Drew's memorial service, the White House and the nation are better for his service. Yet the names of these staffers, let alone their voices and impact, are hardly ever known outside the White House or the third floor of the executive office building. And most Americans, in my argument, deserve to know who they are and what they're fighting for. And at a time when many Americans have doubts about government and questions about the deep state and other sort of conspiracies, we must decide if we want the NSC to keep up the fight, because the NSC staffers are not only the president's warriors, they're all of ours. So I'm happy to sort of, that's one story, and take some questions.
So the first obvious question is, what is the answer? Do we want the NSC staff to continue shoveling coal?
Well, I think the challenge you've got is that they aren't always shoveling coal, to put it mildly, right? So, they're not all like Nelson Drew. What I argue, and I think the thing with this book is I've had a few friends who've served on the staff who've read the book now, and their initial reaction to it was, well, I was a good staffer, right? I did what I was told. Ultimate responsibility holds to the President of the United States and the National Security Advisor. And I think this challenge you get, and I think the value of the book, if there is one, is that it is the cumulative impact and the cumulative body of evidence, which is staffers have an unmatched opportunity to pursue their own agenda with very few checks on it, especially in moments when things go bad in Washington, right? And so the one thing I take from the book is that breakdowns, especially at senior levels of government, are a matter of course in Washington. You can almost set your watch by the number of times you hear about the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense getting in an argument, as they are, or the Secretary of State and the National Security Advisor getting in an argument. You can set your watch by the times the president's frustrated, right? And in these breakdowns are moments of opportunity for staffers to step forward and pursue their own ideas. And in some cases, like Nelson Drew, that they are, and Sandy Birchbell, they're pursuing an idea that has merit and works out in some relatively beneficial way for the American people and the American country, American interest. I think the challenge you get into is when you look at the sum totality of stories here, which really start, as I argue, with Michael Forrestal pushing for the coup against President Diem in South Vietnam in 1963. From Vietnam to Lebanon, to the Gulf War, to Bosnia, to Iraq and Afghanistan, the sum totality of stories and of staffers is that they have deeply pushed the American military into harm's way. And that's part of what militaries are there to do. And certainly the militaries had their say. But I think that the sum story is one where the American way of war has become much more driven by Washington's clock, and specifically the NSC's measure of progress. It's been driven by sort of the fog of Washington as much by the fog of war. And I think that by strengthening and increasing the role of the national security staffers in those decisions, you've taken some accountability from the Defense Department and the State Department, which I think makes for worse policy, worse advice, and worse working relations in Washington. What's funny about, as anybody who's sort of worked in Washington recently, and I found this when I was at the Pentagon, was everybody talks in the country about how political polarization is much worse. And I would argue that the wars of Iraq and Afghanistan have led to a dramatic amount of polarization in government between state and defense and the White House and the two of those. 18 years of war now, and I left and it had been 16 years of war, had led to a much higher level of friction between those entities, in part because high stakes, long wars, frustrating results have led to, I think, a collapse in the benefit of the doubt in Washington between players, which is why I think you see the military much more quickly, especially in the Obama years, accusing the White House of micromanagement. And I think that you lead to people expecting the worst of their colleagues. And I don't think that makes for good policymaking or good decision making.
So one of the reoccurring dynamics in your story throughout history is the bias for action that comes out of the NSC staff, which I think is a structural phenomenon of policy people in the White House. And a great example is the Lebanon case study. So why don't you spend a minute or two talking about the history of the Lebanon situation and how that bias for action plays out, and really, I think your argument is pretty negative ways.
Yeah, I mean, and I think that the Lebanon is a good example, and I think that there is a tendency, especially when you're sitting at the White House, when you're seeing the lack of results on something, and you're getting the sort of pressure that you get at the White House, press for questions, presidents sort of saying, hey, what's going on there, to sort of want progress sooner rather than later. And I think that there's always this belief that you can do more, and sometimes do more with less, which is the sort of story of the Lebanon case, right? So I'm not going to get into the history of Lebanon or the Lebanon or anything else. Yeah, I'll do that. But in 1980, Ronald Reagan was elected president, and he was one of those kind of presidents who said, and there haven't been many, who said, I'm going to go back to following on the sort of breakdowns in Washington of the Kissinger years and the Brzezinski years, right, and the Carter years. I'm not going to try to micromanage policy for the White House. I'm going to let cabinet secretaries do their thing. And he basically said, I'm going to hire people to have complete responsibility, and his national security advisor at the time said, we're downgrading the position of national security advisor and downgrading the position on the staff. And he basically would tell people who were coming to the staff, don't think you're coming here to help shape policy. We are going to run a process, but we are not here to make history, right? And Lebanon was one of those issues that sort of shows you what happens when Washington fails, because it was a hard issue, right? Lebanon was a delicate balance, if not an impossible balance, of communal tribes and communal groups and religious sects, and one that had been in civil war, I guess, at that point from 75, 76, right, off and on. And it was one of those issues that Reagan just couldn't be bothered with, right? I think at one point on the campaign trail he said, I can't understand why they're all fighting, they're all Lebanese. And it sort of shows you his level of attention to detail, which, isn't, the American people elected him anyway. And he was the kind of guy who used to say, I just let the boys figure it out. And the boys, as I always quick to point out, were a group of middle-aged and elderly men, right? So he put in charge of the State Department Alexander Haig, who obviously had served in the military, served in the Army, and then had risen through the ranks at the White House to be Nixon's chief of staff, served ably as one of the enablers of Henry Kissinger's White House shenanigans, and so put him at Secretary of State, who had strong opinions, political ambitions of his own, and was deeply suspicious of White House interference, which is, you probably one of those ones where the sinners always know who could sin again, And he was very worried about that. And then Reagan put in charge of the Defense Department Caspar Weinberger, who had served in the Nixon administration, served in California. It was known as sort of a hard-charging executor, Mac the Knife, as they called him, right? Somebody who knew how to sort of get a budget in line and was a hard-nosed guy, but had also served in the Marines and sort of knew what was going on. So he brought in a group of strong personalities and said, I'm going to downgrade the White House. Unfortunately, on issues like Lebanon, it basically proved that, you know, the Defense Department didn't want anything to do with Lebanon. The State Department was kind of mildly interested in it, but, you know, had a lot of other issues in the world. This is the Cold War era, and as much as there were some Cold War proxy dimensions to the Lebanon Civil War, there were bigger issues and bigger fish to fry. And so you had one of these situations where it was a policy challenge sort of sitting there that was running hot and occasionally would get hotter with assassinations or things along those lines. And the White House would worry about it. And a few aides of a sort of different generation on the NSC staff, and I focus in the book on three. A gentleman named Howard Teicher, who was in his 20s when I think he made it to the NSC staff. He was a product of Johns Hopkins, and one of the few people I interviewed who said when he graduated from college that he declared out loud that he wanted to go work on the National Security Council, which is, you know, a particular ambition when you're 20-something years old, but, you know, probably not that strange to people in this room. Another gentleman named, who was a Navy commander named Phil Durr, who had been commanding I guess he was commanding a destroyer, the Come to Grace, and had basically gotten ordered by the Navy to go to the Pentagon because they needed somebody to go to the NSC, even though he didn't want to. And a gentleman named Jeff Kemp, who had been a professor at Tufts and served as a political advisor to the Reagan campaign. And they had all sort of been at the Pentagon together in the late 70s and had wanted the United States to basically, in the aftermath of the Iranian Revolution and other changes in the region, to exert themselves militarily. Like, we need to go into the region and sort of show our strength to help change events there. And so they were all eager to sort of use Lebanon as the place to do this. They sort of thought, you know, we're a great power. I forget the direct quote, but, you know, what's the point of being a great power if you're not going to do anything about it? And so it became this running tension between the White House, who wanted to use this as an example to exert authority in the Middle East, and the Pentagon and the Defense and the State Department that wanted to keep it at arm's reach. And as different sort of moments of crises developed, Reagan agreed to send in U.S. Marines and a multinational force with the Italians and the French and a few Brits to go serve in Beirut. But as much as the NSC staff pushed for them to take a big role in making the peace in Lebanon and going off into the country, basically the Defense Department said, we want nothing to do with this. This looks, smells, and tastes like Vietnam. We don't know anybody on the ground. We are more interested in rebuilding the Defense Department after the Vietnam years. We don't want to waste this buildup that we've been executing on Lebanon. And so they basically said, we're only going to let the Marines serve as a presence, was the actual term in the mission order, and sit at the Beirut airport and occasionally do some patrols. But so Howard Teicher used the line, we wanted to do more with less. So basically what he argued was, we're just going to do as much as we can with this small contingent of Marines, I think 1,500 or so, and we're going to basically try to help them do more, push them out more, talk louder, try to use them more forcefully. And so they tried everything. And the Pentagon just kept saying no, 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 no. And for a year goes by, no policy changes were made. You had a bombing at the embassy in April of 1982 when several Americans were killed. And everybody in Washington, from the Defense Department, the Intelligence Community, the State Department, kind of figured everybody's going to just pull out. Like, this policy is not going to go anywhere. But the NSC kept saying, we need to do more, we need to do more. And they proposed crazy things. They wanted to deploy the 82nd Airborne to the Lebanon desert. They proposed sending the USS New Jersey, which had just been sort of taken out of mothballs, to go patrol the waters off Beirut to sort of show the flag. They proposed dozens and dozens and dozens of things. But the State Department and Defense Department kept saying no. And then Bud McFarlane, who was a deputy national security advisor, after the State Department's envoy was basically PNG'd and thrown out of Syria, Reagan had no other choice and made Bud McFarlane a member of the NSC staff, his envoy. And he sent Bud McFarlane off to the region to do diplomacy, and he took all these staffers with him. And sitting in the hills of Beirut, they pushed and pushed and prodded to try and get Reagan to lift the rules of engagement and let the Marines take the side of the Lebanese armed forces. And unfortunately, they were very good at sort of persuading and manipulating Reagan. They wrote what was, one memo was called "The Sky is Falling" cable, and if you read it, that was a derisive name that the Pentagon called it. They wrote this cable that was basically way overcooked about the threat that was facing the Lebanese armed forces, and they painted in really vivid terms. They talked about how close the assault was coming from by using distances that Reagan understood. So it was the White House to the Jefferson Memorial, the White House to the State Department, the White House to the Capitol. They said that's how close it is, right? And he was worried. I mean, Reagan, I found in the archives just a little note where he said, "I find this very important." And for somebody who didn't engage very deeply on the details and let people debate it out, that was a big sign for him. And so eventually he was persuaded to open up the rules of engagement, and the Marines started more actively patrolling. The USS New Jersey was deployed to the region, and a Navy ships took fire into the hills of Beirut to try and buy time for the Lebanese armed forces. And a fragile ceasefire was sort of established, and everybody Bud McFarlane looked like a hero, and was actually named National Security Advisor after the National Security Advisor himself stepped down among infighting with the White House. And unfortunately, as Howard Teicher tells the story really well, he was in Beirut at the time, and what he started to see was that the Marines started taking more and more fire. Even though there was a ceasefire, in theory, they were starting to get more and more threats. And he was actually at the airport on October 20th, 1983, having a beer with some of the Marines, and then got on a helicopter and left. And the next morning, the Marines were assaulted when a bomb blew up and killed 241 Marines, right? And even in the aftermath of that, the NSC didn't give up. They kept saying, no, we have to pursue this policy. We have to keep pushing. Even though the Defense Department said absolutely not. And it sort of shows you that what I think you see is the bias for action and the willingness to completely, if not ignore, then discount the operational details that make that action a risk. And so this is one example, but NSC staffer after NSC staffer has argued to go big when we can, to sort of take the shots when we can. In part because there is I think a tendency to want to make history, right? And I don't think that's a strange thing for people who work in Washington to want to do.
I just wanted to write it down.
Yeah, I don't think there's necessarily because of the way the staff is, because they have such short tenures and they have only so much this level of responsibility for so long. I think there's a tendency for action in the short term rather than the long term. And I think that generally speaking, there's a tendency to overvalue the view from the White House, not just because you work for the president and you think the president's right, but because you think you have a better sense of what's going on a whole policy, right? And I found this when I was in government, and I always like to say I was saved by the NSC on a number of occasions when at the Defense Department I would write something and then they'd say, well, that's actually not what the State Department's doing. They're doing X. Or Treasury's actually hasn't sort of announced those sanctions yet. Let's do this. And you'd say, okay, great. Thanks for saving me. There's a 360 worldview at the NSC. They have all the information and can see just about into every agency and know what's going on. But there is a temptation with that worldview to overvalue it and to occasionally think that you are the one who can see best, even if you can only see most. And as a result, that has, I think, led to some more bad ideas and shoveling more than just coal, but some bad ideas into the engine. And I make the argument that if you look, especially on war, the NSC's ideas have been mixed is probably generous. I think that from Vietnam to Afghanistan, the NSC's ideas have been pretty poor. And for every Nelson Drew, there's been 2 or 3 who have shoveled for, and in Reagan's case, Nelson, Howard Teicher, Phil Durr, and Jeff Kemp, who were good public servants, I don't think they were right. And I think even looking back, there's some regrets there. So it's a challenging thing, and it's a responsibility that I think is hard to sort of weigh the responsibility to history and to the bigger picture is hard to weigh when you feel a responsibility to the president and a news cycle that's judging you hourly. And that's a tough balance to pick. And unfortunately, I think most staffers, because they don't have to really answer to anybody, I think occasionally make the wrong decisions in that moment.
All right, I have one more question, then we'll
Sure.
open it up. It is intern season.
Sure.
I don't think you've dissuaded anybody not to serve on the NSC staff. I would imagine most interns would love to serve on the NSC staff at some point in their career because they have self-selected here in Washington, not to make money and to pursue the national interest. Based on your extensive study, this is applied history, how do you get to the NSC staff? And once you're there, how do you make sure that you're not overstepping your bounds and you're fulfilling your responsible duties as a public servant?
Good question. So how do you get there? So I can say, I think that it's interesting, especially because you're already in Washington, so most of them have taken the first step if you're interested and you've already come to Washington, or you're watching, I guess, at home or in your dorm room. You got to get here and you got to get paid for. I think that there are a few NSC staffers who get there by working on campaigns, right? But the vast majority are loaned by the State Department, the Defense Department, the intelligence community. So you got to get in. You got to get into one of the bureaucracies or into the military. And choosing to serve at the highest levels is harder than just choosing to serve. And you can work your way up through one of those agencies or one of the military branches and eventually get there. Right? Nelson Drew, actually, interestingly enough, actually did a little internship on the NSC at one point in 1980, and he always wanted to get back. But it's not exactly like a job you apply for, right? It's something you work your way up, and eventually you're found a need. The two things I always tell people, especially at the University of Pennsylvania where I work, is number one, know something, right? So learning something, and perhaps learning something that not everybody is focused on, right? So those folks who were learning Russian in 2006 are benefiting from the fact that they chose to do something that not everybody else was learning right now. Just as those studying Arabic in 1995 are looking smarter. So know something, pick something that I think technical sometimes is better than regional, right? The second thing is know how to do something, which is my advice to everybody in government, which is everybody in government wants to give advice, but the decision makers often want somebody that can help them do something. So I wrote speeches, learn how to deal with the press, learn the Hill, learn how to deal with the military or serve in the military, right? Those are useful things. And then sort of work your way up and pursue it. I think what we're seeing is that the staff is younger than they used to be, right? So Jeff Kemp, Howard Teicher, and Phil Durr were anomalies at the time. They were in their late 20s and 30s when they're on the staff. That's more normal now. So I think because the hours are grueling, most people have to do it before they have kids and things along those lines. So I think that those are the sort of how to get there, and volunteer for it when you can.
So what's the one internal mental check that you should have when you're on the NSC staff to make sure that you do not exceed your bounds?
Exceed your bounds. I think that one, know history, right? And
You're just kissing up right now.
For sure, But I think knowing this history would at least, I don't think most NSC staffers know the history of the institution or know who Nelson Drew is, right? And there's a Nelson Drew Award that has been given off and on since he was killed for service to the country, right? And the NSC has given it mostly in Democratic administrations, I guess it ran out soon. So I think know the temptations when you're sitting in that position. And unfortunately, because the scholarship has been so terrible on it, there's this suspicion that you're just doing what the president wants. And I think learning the difference between doing what the president wants and sort of convincing the president to do something he shouldn't do are very fine lines. But I think these stories will help you appreciate where that line is. And so knowing history and knowing, I think, the history of the past 70 years, which not to kiss up here, is something that I'm always staggered how little people appreciated when I was in government. Right? I remember being in meetings where it felt as if everybody was just reading it from like the script of Hunt for Red October on Russia. You're just like, does anybody have anything depth of knowledge here on the Cold War? And unfortunately, I think America's foreign policy since the end of World War II is one that would be humbling if you know it. and realizing how many bad ideas have floated to the fore. And listen, there are days when the bad idea is the best idea. So there's days when they're like that, but having the humility that history sort of provides policymakers, especially those in this position, I think would be deeply valuable.
Great. All right, let's take some questions. Do we have, Emma, are we going to do a microphone?
We got a mic, I guess.
Jade. Javed, back corner first.
Ringer.
Plant.
Ringer in the room. Javed Ali, visiting professor, University of Michigan. Thanks to you both.
And
John,
and former NSC staff?
Well, I was going to get to that.
Okay.
But John, thanks for this really important piece of work on absolutely a very misunderstood or less researched part of the NSC. And Seth, it was great working with you on the NSC. What I really enjoyed about working with Seth on the NSC, you're the only person in the whole building who I could talk college sports with. So usually most people were focused on the job, but Seth and I usually talked about college sports when we were there. All right, serious question to John. You mentioned at least 4 or 5 different archetypes of staff, and I'd be curious from the depth of the research that you did, were you seeing trends within different administrations on sort of, different archetypes, a higher percentage of others across administrations, or was it generally sort of the same percentage, activists versus coal shovelers and everything in between?
It's a good question. I mean, I think what I sort of study is, I think that what you sort of see, I think, is Ivo Daalder makes this point, and he's one of the sort of big writers in national security, and he served on the staff, is that, like, however small the staff is, it'll be like, I think he says 3 times that size by the end of the administration. So you sort of see like this trend towards growing. And he believes that there's an argument that like a stronger staff is most important at the beginning when you're trying to wrest policy back into what the president wants. I think what you found, and the best archetype that I see is one that isn't Evo's, is actually Condi Rice's. And she sort of explained to me in an interview, and it was one of the more lucid interviews because she had served on the staff, one of the few, the number of national security advisors who have served on the staff at one point is it's actually a pretty high number. And she said, there's a huge difference between a peacetime staff and a wartime staff. And, Nelson Drew, for all that was going on in Bosnia, was on a peacetime staff. And for much of its history, it was a peacetime staff, right? And so the biggest change happened when the country went to war after 9/11. And not only did you see a gigantic increase in the size of the staff, but a gigantic increase in what the staff tried to do, right? And that isn't just all out of ambition, right? Staffers didn't just want to become a wartime managing staff because the glory. It was also as much abdication because, as you sort of see, starting in like 2005, the Defense Department and the State Department kind of threw up their hands on the wars and sort of said, this is the best we got. And it drove the NSC to go deeper and deeper into managing the wars. I tell the story, the first story I start with, the first person I started with is Megan O'Sullivan, who was in her 30s and she had her Georgetown undergrad, worked on the Hill, was a Democrat, got her doctorate from Oxford, ended up at Brookings working with Richard Haas, who is another person I profile, who served on the staff, and went on to policy planning after 9/11. And so she then went to war in Iraq as a civilian and served in Iraq and Baghdad for 15 months. And she came back and ended up being the sort of senior policy staffer working on the wars for George W. Bush. And they basically were sitting here going, we're not getting the right information from the field. And they basically, the PDB wasn't sufficient, the military intelligence state weren't providing intelligence in real time. And they created a whole briefing for the president called the Iraq brief. The nightly brief, the night note, whatever they had different names. They would write 3 to 5 pages of their own assessment based on their own sources of what was going on in Iraq in the war every day. And she would write it and would go to the president. And I interviewed Don Rumsfeld, which is a life experience that everybody should have. I asked him, I was like, did you know about this? He goes, I had a feeling it was going on, but I never saw one, didn't ever ask. And these were going to the president directly. And that was something that Condi basically, Rice said, we got to give him the intel. He's the commander-in-chief. We got to give him the intelligence. And then very slowly, they also said, well, we got to give him the ideas. And they tried 1,000 ways to get new ideas to the president. And a lot of them kept failing until they basically wrote a surge, right? They did the math on the troop rotations. They came up with a strategy, and they gave it to the president. But it was only after everything else failed. And then what you see is that model of staffer kind of stuck around and has literally been adopted, or at least inherited, by the Obama administration, which kept the war czar who replaced Megan Sullivan, Doug Lute, and that was the staffer they saw, which was hands-on, deeply involved in military planning and management. So I think that the biggest change is the wartime staff, and that has led to dramatic overreach in other parts of the staff, in part because that's the model, right? And that becomes what the president expects, right? Which is, if everybody else is giving me ideas and intelligence, why aren't you giving me ideas and intelligence on China? So the wartime staff, in part because the wars haven't ended, has, I think, become the model. It's obviously changed a little bit in the Trump administration, but wow, that's probably putting it mildly. But the wartime staff is what Washington now expects, and that is the biggest change and the biggest archetype. And I don't know if we'll ever go back to a peacetime staff, which is, I think, worrying, because I think those were the best staffs. I think the Scowcroft-Haas staff and the Lake Vershbow Drew staff did the best work, in part because they had the smallest writ. Right? They didn't try to do everything. They just said, we're going to do the little things, make sure the president can get on a phone call and be educated enough to target Margaret Thatcher. And they did ask the big questions, like, where's this going? Right? We got 500,000 troops in Iraq in 1990. Where is this all going? Like, what's the end game here? And that's, to a degree, what Vershbow and Nelson Drew were doing. They're like, where is this headed? Those are the right questions to be asking. The wartime staff has been forced by abdication, presidential asks, and ambitions to provide the answers. And they're great at asking questions, the staff. They're terrible at providing answers. And I think that's because they almost always say, let's surge, for lack of a better term. Yeah.
Chick Feldmer, Munitions Industrial Task Force.
Right.
My question is, given that the NSC is in a position to make recommendations directly to the president, did you find an increased lobbying effort both among defense, state, but other industry or anyone else in the lobbying business trying to get their ideas into the NSC so it would become part of NSC's recommendation?
It's a good question. So as somebody who was at the Defense Department and for a while and sort of got to know the sort of defense side of lobbying a little bit from the other side, I would say that that's still the primary place to go, because the NSC famously has no money. I mean, none whatsoever. I think the budget for the NSC is like something like $15 million or something, just absolutely minimal. So they don't have a lot of spending authority. I think that the lobbying that goes on at the NSC is less industrial and more foreign. And so there is not an embassy in town that just doesn't try to leverage and lobby the staff and leverage and lobby the National Security Advisor. And I think that's certainly been found in this administration, but also was true in the Obama administration, which was especially like China. China had less time for the ambassador and the Secretary of State than they ever would give to the National Security Advisor and the staff. Right, that was the focus, because they knew those are the people who had the president's ear. So I think that I have not seen a ton in my experience or research of lobbying on industrial or sort of practical sort of platforms and hardware, but I have seen a lot more lobbying of the staff by foreign officials and foreign interests. And so I think that that's a natural target for them, because it's kind of going around the middleman. Whereas with industrial stuff, the middleman is still the one that has the congressional appropriation to buy things. So that's my experience. I don't know if anybody else, you might have more experience with it. I don't know. Were you lobbied for any arms deals while you were there? Seth?
I'm at a think tank, so I think that's the answer. Just kidding. I'm kidding. Carter, you got a question?
Yeah, part on the staff. So you painted a
Grim.
Thank you. You painted a very grim picture of the NSC. I mean, it leads us to wars, and it's not accountable. It's undermining democracy. And so what's the solution? Is the solution to get rid of the wartime staff and functioning of the NSC? Is that possible in a situation where, unfortunately, we're still at war? Is it to get rid of the NSC entirely? Is it to reduce its job to kind of what you're describing in Scowcroft terms, that, well, you're going to provide the president the immediate prep he needs to go into a meeting, ask some big questions, not do any more than that?
Yeah.
Is it possible to make any of those changes?
Yeah, so it's a good question. So writing a book is very entertaining because it turns out people who read it have opinions about it. And sometimes they write them down on the internet, which has been very fun to read occasionally, even though I'm not supposed to read those things. But I have a newborn at home, so I'm sitting there in the middle of the night and reading reviews of my book, which is fairly entertaining. And so the question is, I take the argument that, and I think knowing the history of it, like I find it interesting, and I sort of tell this story, which is Franklin Roosevelt won World War II without an NSC, but all of government thought he needed one, right? Because he kind of kept everybody in the dark and drove everybody crazy, and that's the foundation of the staff, right? Is basically a bunch of folks said, we can't have one guy in a wheelchair running a global war from the Oval Office, right? We need him in a council. So I think integration of policy, somebody having eyes on everything, is a good thing and would need to exist. And as I say in the book, if you didn't have the NNC, you'd need to invent it, right? Like you would need that in Washington right now. So I think there's a few things. I argue in the book there's actually very little legal foundation for what the staff does, right? So there's actually very few legal, it was founded in one line of law. There's very little law that says this is what you do, right? And as everybody who's served in uniform or in government knows, the chain of command is a murky thing, right? There is a flow chart, there's an organizational chart, but it's a little bit more done in the gray area. So I think what I call the common law, right, the things that are expected of the staff and not expected of the staff, needs to sort of, I think, evolve a little bit. So I think focusing a little bit more on, hey, that's probably not your lane, and giving both the managers of the staff, the National Security Advisor, giving the staffs themselves some level of knowledge of where they should be going, I think would be good. Giving them some historical knowledge to sort of, and things to go. I think it's a weird organization to kind of join where you're just learning on the job from each other and from previous staffers, which is why whenever you ask somebody about the staff, their basic knowledge of it is basically 4 or 5 years. It's the 2 years before they went, the 2 years they were on it, and the year after they left, right? And that's their historical knowledge of the staff, which was, those guys annoyed the hell out of me. Then they annoyed the hell out of me when I was in the job. Then I was the annoying one. And then I went back and was annoyed again and I left government, right? That's basically how it goes. So I think like having some historical knowledge would be useful. My argument though is that the biggest issue is that the NSC has never asked questions themselves, right? They get to ask all the questions, and they can call that, although some sec defs claim they don't take their calls, they can pretty much call the Defense Department at any time and ask what the hell's going on. And they use their Tambergs and everything else. And technology has allowed them to reach in a much farther way. But there's nobody ever reaching into the staff to ask them questions. And I think that for that reason, I'm a fan of opening them up to accountability to Congress, which is, I think, knowing that somebody other than the President of the United States is going to ask them what the hell they're doing is a important change, and I think will lead to a greater, not a level of transparency, but it will be a forcing mechanism for discipline on the staff itself in terms of what they're recommending. If they have to answer for their ideas at some point, I think that they're going to be much more cautious with their ideas, and probably a little more cautious when they raise their voice on them. And I think history suggests that's going to be okay if we did that. So I'm open for Congress knowing, or at least having some level of approval, who goes onto the staff. I think that that's something, especially with senior military officers, they exert that authority, but they don't on others. And I think that evening those things out would be good for equality in Washington and for, I think, the debate within Washington. And I think there's an argument to be made for some level of congressional testimony, whatever that is. I think that there's a way to do it. So that's my proposal, which I actually think will lead to better discipline and better organization. And I think people following and staying in their lanes a little bit more.
So I have an important request. When you write the second edition, you start with a very important anecdote of Javed and I in the 5 corridor of the NSC arguing about Michigan football to embody all that is wrong with the National Security Council.
Of course. Yeah, Michigan football.
Join me in congratulating John on the terrific book.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you
John.
very much. Thank you.
What's up, man?
Thank you. Is that all right?
Yeah, it's great. Terrific.
And if you're interested, you can buy the book just about anywhere. So please, Kramer's has them, everybody has them. So give it a look. Thank you very much. And thanks, Seth.